Okay, so hello everyone, welcome to my design class. I'm Connor and welcome to this new live stream all about vectors and raster graphics in Adobe Photoshop. So this live stream is all about based on a question that I received in one of the last live streams, which was basically what is the difference between vector and raster graphics in Photoshop? What are the different uses that you might want to actually choose one over the other? And what do vectors actually look like in Adobe Photoshop? So where can we find vectors? How can we create vectors? And how can we actually convert between vector and raster graphics? And why might we want to choose one over the other? Do stick around to the end of the video. I'm actually going to be showing you how you can change a raster image into a vector graphic, if that's something you're interested in. We're also going to be looking at how we can change text objects into vector graphics so that we can actually go ahead and manipulate the fonts themselves. So do stay tuned for that. After this, I'm also going to be live on my film class with a tutorial about color correction in Adobe Premiere Pro. So if that's something that you're interested in learning as well, then do stick around to the end of this tutorial. Hopefully it should automatically send you to that live stream. But if not, I'm going to be live on my film class at just about 1 o'clock, just after this live stream. So let's jump right in and get used to Adobe Photoshop again. So what I'm actually going to do to start with is just go to Window and Workspace and just reset Essentials. And I like to do this before the start of every tutorial just to make sure that we're both on the same page. So if you do like to follow along with Photoshop alongside while watching these live streams or these tutorials, then you can actually go ahead and go to Window, Workspace and reset Essentials. And our screens should look very similar and you should be able to follow along just fine. All the buttons should be in the correct places. Perfect. So let's talk a bit about vectors and raster graphics. What essentially is the difference between the two? So first of all, one of the things that you do quite frequently in Photoshop is open up a photo. So for example, here I have an image of an apple. And this image is made up of all sorts of pixels. And these pixels are different colors, small squares that basically build up an image. So if I zoom into this photo, you can see all of the individual pixels. We have different shades of red, different shades of yellow in this case, and all of these different pixels, when we zoom out, form an image. And our computers, which are also displaying pixels, show us an image which looks like an apple to us. The difference between, so this is essentially a raster file. It's made up of loads of different pixels, and the benefit of raster files immediately is that you can convey a whole load of different colors, a lot of different colors, more than you can when you're using vectors. So the difference between that and vectors is that vectors are essentially a mathematical formula that programs such as Photoshop or even Illustrator, which is exclusively vectors, use in order to calculate different shapes and things that you might want to create, which makes it especially handy for creating logos. So just to illustrate that slightly better, if anyone checked out the post that I put out on Friday, then you'll know that the tool that I was referring to was the pen tool, and the shortcut to that is the letter P on your keyboard. So essentially, a vector is a whole load of dots and lines or curves that connect the two. So I can press anywhere on screen in order to create a dot, and that starts off our vector formula, our mathematical formula that's going to calculate our vector. If I then create another dot anywhere on screen, it's automatically going to create another dot and a line connecting to the two. And this is the start of our shape when we're creating vector shapes in Photoshop. So there's a mathematical formula which is working out the distance between the two dots, and I can just keep going and creating all sorts of dots and completing the shape that I've created, and now I have a vector shape. So the benefit of this method is that we're not actually drawing on individual pixels onto our canvas. And because it's a mathematical formula, it can always be adapted and scaled to any size. So one of the issues that we have when we go to an image and we try to scale this in Photoshop is if I quickly convert this just by pressing on the lock icon, I can change the background layer into just a normal layer. If I try to scale this image, the greater that I scale this image, if I just do it very dramatically, let's say 1000, you'll notice that we lose a lot of quality in our image because the pixels are automatically being stretched and pulled in all different directions, which means that they're no longer sharp at all. One way to combat this is to convert this to a smart object. We can't add any resolution to our images, but we can maintain the image resolution that it currently has. So if you ever make your image file smaller, then a smart object will actually let you retain that original resolution. If you want to know more about that, then check out the last live stream that we did last week, because that's a really great way to ensure that you're using a non-destructive process in Photoshop. However, when we're using vector files in Photoshop, it's slightly different. So if I actually go ahead and fill in this vector file, so I'm just going to create a new layer. I'm going to go to paths, which is where we can see the vector information in our Photoshop document. So you can see I have this working path. One thing to note, if you've never used vectors before, this work path won't actually save automatically. You do have to drag that down into this new vector or new path icon, and that's actually going to create path 1, which is now going to save every time. If I went ahead and actually created a new vector or a new path, it'd actually overwrite the original work path. And so that is one thing to bear in mind. But what I can do is I can just make sure that I have a color selected. So for example, let's just make this nice and clear and go for a black. And then I can press on this icon here in order to fill in our shape. So what you'll notice is I've now created a raster layer. So I've created a raster image from this vector path. So this is now when I'm on the layers, this is actually a raster. If I try and scale this up, you'll notice that it is actually going to blur on the edges because it's stretching a raster file. However, the benefit of using a vector is that if I actually did want to make this thing larger, what I do is actually change the original vector path. And I could enlarge this in order to actually ensure that I maintain that resolution. So to do that, I could just go to the pen tool and I could just hold Command, and this will actually bring up the direct selection tool. And as you can see, I can select our vector, I can press Command and T, and I can now go ahead and scale our vector up. And now I could actually go ahead and refill in this path. And as you can see, I've now got an enlarged version of my vector file. However, it's sharp because we've changed the vector and not the rasterized image that we'd created. So this is the main benefit of vectors. Vectors essentially allow you to scale your designs to any resolution, which makes it very, very handy when you're using things or creating things such as logos. Because when you're designing a logo for a client, you might need that logo to be really small in order to fit, for example, as an app icon on your phone. But you might also really need a much, much larger version of your logo. If, for example, the logo needed to be placed on a billboard on the side of a highway, in which case you need a very large version of your logo. So this is an easy way to be able to maintain that resolution no matter the size of your design. The downside of vectors is that you're slightly limited in the use of colors in your vectors. So one easy way to create a vector in Photoshop is actually to create a shape. And all the shapes that we have are on this side icon toolbar here. And the shortcut to it is U on your keyboard. So you can actually select, for example, the ellipse tool. And what you'll notice is that I'm going to create a vector. So I can create an ellipse just by freeforming the thing like this, or I can hold Shift to actually create a regular circle. And what you'll notice is I've created a vector layer now. So as you can see, the thumbnail for the layer has actually changed. You can see there's this small vector icon or path icon, or even shape icon, whatever you want to call it, which basically means that it's the design on this layer is determined by a vector or by a path. And you can actually view that path just under the Paths tab here. If you can't see the paths, just go to Window and you should be able to select Paths from here, just here. So the benefit of this, once again, is because it's a vector, we can actually scale it to any dimension. So I can press Command and T, make the vector much, much smaller, and it's still going to be sharp. I could do the opposite. I could scale it up, and it's still going to be sharp because every time Photoshop is adapting the pixels on the layer to the mathematical formula of the path itself. So that's the benefit of using vectors. However, what you'll notice is that we are very limited in how we can actually fill in that layer. For example, the fill, we can only select solid colors, or we could use a gradient. But for example, in images, we might need much, much more complex color arrangements. For example, in this image, we have a whole load of different colors which stretch in all sorts of different directions and transform and merge into other colors. And it'd be very hard to actually replicate that in the use of vectors. So that's one of the downside of using vectors, is that you actually lose some of the control of how many colors you can use in vectors and how they are presented. So which is better? Well, it kind of always depends on what you need to design. Vectors are very handy, like I said, if you're designing logos. They're also very handy for web design projects, where you might need your interface to scale to all sorts of different sizes, depending on the platform that your user is using. For example, if they looking at your website via mobile, or they're looking at your website via a 5K monitor, it's going to be a very different experience. You need that design to be able to stretch in all sorts of different ways, but while maintaining that resolution. Once again, you might also be limited by how you receive the original working files or your source files for the actual design. So for example, if you get a photo sent to you, or even if you're using video, you're going to be limited because the initial file is already going to be a rasterized file. In this case, this is a .jpeg file, and this is a raster file, so it's made up of pixels. So unfortunately, the data is already in a raster format, so you're kind of limited by the resolution of the source material. So that's why people are constantly trying to upgrade the resolution, so that you can work with much larger files to increase that resolution. You can obviously use a combination of both, depending on what your design is for. Certain aspects in a poster design, for example, might have raster images, which are kind of the images that are used in the photos, but then you might also use things such as shapes or other more simple designs, which you can use as vectors, so that you can always reuse it in another format if you're trying to design a leaflet, which is slightly smaller in the future. So it all depends kind of on what you need to use it for. The best thing about vectors is obviously that it's a non-destructive process. So you can always go back and actually make changes to that initial file as well, which is kind of much more handy than a raster file, because you're very limited by, you know, the designs that you can do, because it's already kind of set in stone. I can't go and actually change all of the reds in this image without applying a destructive process. A non-destructive process for that would be using an adjustment layer, which again is slightly different. But initially, or essentially, it's always going to be producing a raster file at the end of the day. So there are different ways you can also save your raster files. A .eps file is a vector file, so you can actually store that vector information, perhaps export it to software such as Illustrator, which is exclusively kind of using vectors. And that's why a lot of designers also like to actually use Illustrator in order to design vector-based designs, because they have that ability, and Illustrator gives you a lot of tools in order to use vectors and vector shapes. So yeah, that's essentially the differences between vector and raster graphics. There are certain anomalies to this. So for example, text objects. Text objects aren't actually... I have just applied that within the actual shape, which is something you could do if you didn't know that. If you have a vector file selected or a path selected, you can actually add text to the outline of your path, or actually to the center of your shape. So it's all restricted to the size of your shape. So text objects are actually a completely different type of file. They aren't actually vector based or raster based. It's kind of its own thing in Photoshop. But one of the things that you might want to be able to do is actually control the font and how your text looks. So you might want to convert it to a path, so you can actually manipulate different parts of your text, because at the moment I have no control over the look of the individual characters. So the easiest way to do this is to make sure you have your text object selected, go to the properties, scroll all the way to the bottom, and you can actually convert it to a frame or a shape. So if you convert it to a shape, it's automatically going to convert to a shape file, and you're actually going to have all of that vector information in this path right here. So you can actually go ahead and manipulate that. So just using the pen tool, you can add points to it, maybe drag parts out, if you just select the one, of course. and actually make changes to that font that you're trying to manipulate. So that's a nice way to be able to actually convert a text object into a vector file, which is something that you might want to use if you want a greater degree of control for your text objects. Another case where you might want to convert the two is actually converting a raster file into a vector object. So once again, like I said at the start, you're going to be slightly limited. You can't actually copy all of the information, all of the color information into a vector file, just by the nature of a vector file only being able to support a very limited range of colors. But we can actually, there are some tricks in order to actually create outlines that are vector shapes from raster images. So the easiest way to do this is I'm first going to convert this to a smart object, and that's basically going to ensure that anything I apply is a non-destructive process, so I can always go back and actually manipulate the initial image. Check out the last live stream for more information on that. So what I want to do is I want to kind of limit the information in my image so that I'm only sourcing a few particular colors. The less colors that we have, the easier it's actually going to be to create that vector file. So in order to do this, what we can do is first create a selection of the object in our scene. So you can either, if you have a subject in your image, you can go to select and select subject, and Photoshop is going to try and select that subject for you. I like to use the object selection tool when there's not a real clear subject. It can do a pretty good job at selecting objects too, but it's slightly easier to use the object selection tool. So as you can see, I can just create a selection of this apple like this. Now, if I was spending more time on this, I'd actually go ahead and try and maybe use select and mask in order to actually make sure that the selection was accurate. But just for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to keep the selection rather simple, so it's not going to be 100% accurate in this case. So what I can do is now create a layer mask for this apple. Another thing that I'll show later is how you can actually create a vector mask, which is something that I covered in the first live stream. But it's something that's very useful in order to, because the mask itself is also a rasterized element. So in order to create a vector element for your mask, you can actually create a vector mask as well, which allows you to always go back and make changes to your vectors without using any of that resolution or quality in your vectors as well. So just to highlight that, if you press Alt or Option on your keyboard, depending on your Windows or Mac, you can actually just see what the mask is applying or affecting. And as you can see, the mask itself is also made up of pixels. So if you ever try and change the size of your image, or you want to change the size of your mask, it's also beneficial to use vectors because they're non-destructive and you can actually change that resolution in the future as well. So I'm just going to press Option or Alt on that layer mask thumbnail again, and I'm going to be back into my original canvas. So now that we've got a selection of our image, what we're going to try and do is use a whole load of different things, so maybe filters or adjustment layers, in order to actually control the amount of colors that we have in our image. So what I like to do is actually to use a black and white adjustment layer. This gives you quite a lot of control over the actual the look of the image. I'm going to be creating just a black and white vector. You can leave the colors in if that's something you're interested in. But for this case, I'm going to be using black and white because I think it gives you slightly better control. I'm also going to use a clipping mask for that, just in case I did have anything else in the background of my image. So that's only going to apply to the layer just below it. So you can just use Option or Alt in order to apply that clipping mask to that adjustment layer. So next, what we can do is maybe add the Rasterize adjustment layer. And this is actually going to limit the amount of colors that we have in our image. So once again, I'm also going to apply that as a clipping mask. And as you can see under the properties, I can actually adjust the levels. So the more levels you have, the more colors you're essentially adding to your image. The less you have, you're only sampling two different colors. So we have black and white at the moment. But the more shades of gray that I add, obviously the more colors we are able to retain. So for a vector, we obviously want to try and use as few colors as possible in order to get a as defined selection as possible of each of the colors in our image. So one of the first ways that we can actually do this, before we do all this, is we can essentially what we need in order to create the vector is a selection. So you can actually create a selection just using the selection of the layer mask that we created. And this selection you can use in order to create a vector. So just making sure that I have any selection tool selected. So I'm just going to press M to go to the marquee tool. What I can do is I can actually go to paths. I can just right click on my image and I can go to make work path. And here you can set a tolerance. So the lower the tolerance, the more nodes or the more dots Photoshop is going to add to try and create a perfect selection. The higher the tolerance, the less it's going to add and the more curves it's going to create. So I'll just demonstrate this quickly. So if I put 0.5, you'll see that you get a pretty accurate vector. So it's converted as best as Photoshop can your selection into a vector. But as you can see, it's using lots and lots of dots. And this is going to create a very rugged shape. So for example, if I create a new layer, quickly hide the background one, and maybe I'll fill this one in just using the color that we've already got. As you can see, it's going to create a very, very rugged shape because it's using so many dots to calculate our vector. However, if we use a higher tolerance, so if I go back to the marquee tool, right click, and I go to make work path, let's say I use a tolerance of 3, which is slightly higher, it's going to use less dots and it's going to try and use as many curves in order to create the vector. However, you can notice that it's always going to be, it's not going to be 100% accurate. It's only doing a guessing game. Photoshop is trying its best to replicate our selection, but it's definitely not going to be perfect. So it's going to be slightly further out because we've set a high tolerance from that initial selection that we created. But once again, if I do fill this in, you'll notice that the selection is much, much smoother. So that's already one way that we can actually go ahead and create a vector from our shape. But if we want some more of that detail in our image, then we can actually go ahead and use the second process in order to add that. So what I can do is I can use the black and white, and this is why I quite like using the black and white adjustment layer. You can actually go ahead and manipulate those individual colors and actually control the amount of color that we have in each. So if I set them all to black, or just to pretty much low, you'll notice that the outline is pretty simple. We're basically getting that initial outline that we created with our mask. But by using these sliders, you can actually control, you can say, okay, well, I want this to actually be included in one of my layers, and then maybe I'll try and reduce it slightly further, etc. You can also use filters. So as long as this is an adjustment, a smart object, you can go to filter, maybe add a blur, such as a surface blur, in order to make these outlines much, much more simple. So for example, it all depends kind of on the look that you're going for. You can set a different threshold in order to add more or less of the surface blur. So maybe you can also control the levels. Say you wanted more or less levels. So let's go for 4. And maybe I want to increase this so that I'm making it slightly more simple, like this. Now I'm only doing a rough thing because I'd quite like to actually get that detail in the top part, maybe in one or two of these other ones, but just to show you very quickly how you could do this. And what I'm next going to do is I'm going to select all the layers and go to convert to smart object. And this is essentially going to blend it all into that one layer that we have. So in order to actually select these different colors, what we can do is we can go to select, and then we can go to color range. And from here, we can actually sample different colors and select all of those colors within that range. So I'm actually going to set the fuzziness to 0 because I don't want any change, but I'm going to select this black color first. And what it's going to do is create a selection of that darker color. So next, what I can do is I can go to a selection tool, such as the marquee tool, right click once again, and go to make work path. So maybe let's set it to 1.5. So as you can see, it's not 100% perfect, so I'd probably want to go in and manually change a few of these points. But for the demonstration, I'm just going to save that as an initial path. If you didn't want to save it as a path and you actually want to create a layer straight away, what you can do is once you've made that, you can just go to the adjustment layers, create a solid color, press OK, and you're automatically going to have a shape layer, which is essentially your vector path that we created. So if I actually hide that, you'll see that we have all of that information within that one layer. If I wanted to go ahead and select the other colors, so I'll quickly go and do that, select color range, maybe select the second color, press OK, and now I can create another path just by going to make work path, set the tolerance to that, maybe create another solid color. So we have this one on a separate, layer. And then finally, I'll do that last one as well. I'll just go to select color range, select the last color that we have, press OK. And now go to right click, make work path, press 1.5. Okay, great. And then create the solid color once again, like so. Now, if I hide the initial layer, you can see that we've got all of that information in vectors. So I would need to go through and perhaps adjust tolerance depending on how I wanted to, how many nodes or how many dots I wanted to use. Or I could also go through and actually manually change these. So if I select one of these and go to the pencil, I can actually go ahead and actually change all of these things. So that's the kind of the benefits of using this method in order to turn some things to vectors. So what you'll notice is what we've done is we've changed them all to vectors, and we have had a bit of that issue that we've lost a lot of the color information. We've actually had to make it a lot more simple, but it is a quick way to be able to add an outline. So for example, we could create a vector of the outline of just the apple itself. So if you wanted to turn that into a logo or use it as inspiration for a logo, this is a great place to start, and you can actually go ahead and change those dots individually. And then for the others, you can add more of that shading information in just by creating, using these kind of different effects in order to get those different color bands and add some of that information back into your vector. So that's kind of one quick way to turn your rasterized files into vector files. Now, obviously the control, you might want to use different filters in order to smooth out the original image so that you get better control over those colors, or you get a smoother result than, for example, something like this where you have a lot of jagged edges. And playing around with that tolerance is always going to be something that you might want to do, and it's going to very much be different on a case-to-case basis for all the videos that you have, for all of the different images that you use in your designs. So yeah, essentially that was a quick introduction on the difference between vectors and rasterized graphics in Photoshop and the different ways you might want to use them and the different places that you can find them within Photoshop. So do let me know in the comments if you found this useful and if you have any other questions on the topic. Another thing to note is that I do have a newsletter which is every week, so if you are interested in signing up to that, I do let you know in advance what we're going to be talking about in the next week's video. So that's a great way to stay ahead and kind of get your questions ready and maybe go through any of the problems that you might be encountering, so that you can bring those to the live stream and we can actually look at those together and try and solve that all in the live stream. But other than that, thanks for tuning in. And like I said, I will be live in my film class in just about a half an hour. So do join me there if that's something you're interested in learning Premiere Pro. And other than that, I shall see you in the next live stream.